Hi everyone and welcome to the sew along. So I'm going to be sewing the long sleeve version of this top. I'll show you how to deal with the short sleeve version as we go. First of all, we're dealing with both a knit and a woven fabric together. So for the woven fabric, you're going to need something really light and floaty, a summer weight fabric. Polyesters are great. Rayons, just something with a lot of drape to it that flows. I'm using a polyester chiffon. And for the woven, you're just going to need a t-shirting weight cotton. Now I'm working with a cotton lycra today. I am a bit concerned that it might have a lot of stretch, which is the reason why I'm going to use it, just to check it out for the pattern. To help you sew this, it might be good if you had a silicone foot, a Teflon foot here. A walking foot might help as well, but just see how you go as you move along. Right, so we have varied seam allowances with this pattern. We have both 1 centimetre, which is 3/8 of an inch, and 6mm seam allowances. That's just to make it easier for things like the neckband to sew on with. So if you're using a plain sewing machine, make sure you have a ball needle in it. That will just help to make sure that we don't put any holes and create ladders in our knit fabric. Also make sure you have a nice sharp new needle in it, because if you're using a light floaty fabric, you just don't want to cause any puckers or any drags. You want a nice sharp stitch with your needle. So when you're ready, do a test stitch on both your fabrics combined. So do a test stitch with the polyester, with the with the woven and the knit together, and just check your tensions are right before we get started. So this is our patch pocket piece. It has notches around the outside which show us the hem allowance position. Now at one edge there'll be a notch quite far down, and that's 1 inch down, or 2.5 centimetres, and that's going to be the turn position for the top of our pocket. So right ways up, that's what our pocket is going to look like. But to get started, what we have to do is overlock around all 4 sides of our pocket to secure it and stop it from fraying or unwinding. Sometimes you can get away with just overlocking the top and leaving 3 sides raw. It's really up to you. So notice when we overlock, you can still see the notches through the overlocking, and we need to make sure we can see the notches through our overlocking. Right, so we're going to go to an iron now, and you need to press this at the notch position. So what that means is we're going to press this under 1 inch, 2.5 centimetres at the top, and each of these sides needs to be pressed under 1 centimetre, which is 3/8 of an inch. The other thing to mention is make sure you test your iron temperature on spare fabric before you touch your real fabric. Right, so here is our patch pocket all ironed up. So the first thing we need to do is secure the top edge. So the easiest way I find is if you turn the pocket to the wrong side and stitch a line of stitching from side to side directly through the overlocking line. And there's no need to back tack this. Now because I want to make it look like a commercially sewn garment, what I'm going to do is sew a second line of stitching parallel to the first on the fold side. And the width of that is completely up to you. Right, so now we need to go to our garment and place the pocket in the correct position. Now if you want to, go ahead back to your iron and just repress those other 3 sides in. If you're happy, just continue. So here is my patch pocket re-ironed and ready to go on the front. And here is my front piece, right side up. And what I've done is I marked the drill holes on my fabric with chalk. I realised you couldn't see it very well in the video, so what I've done is I've just put the head of the needle through the drill hole position. So where this goes in is the drill hole position. Now on the pattern it says that drill holes are marked 1 centimetre in from the final position. So 1 centimetre is 3/8 of an inch. So what that means is you have to imagine, so this is my drill hole here, you have to imagine 1 centimetre in the position there, and that position there is the position of the drill hole, because what we're trying to do is cover the drill holes, because in commercial pattern making, drill holes are physical holes that the cutters cut into our fabric, and they're physical holes so that we can see where to place. So for our next position, exactly the same thing. There's my chalk. I've just got to imagine 1 centimetre in and down, 3/8 of an inch, and then that goes exactly on top of that drill. Now I'm just going to pin it in the stitch line there. Now make sure you've got ball pins when you're doing this. So with all these little straggly bits of overlocking, if you've chosen to overlock, just make sure they're tucked under. And what we're looking for is to just make sure that our pockets are in the correct position. Or the pocket, not the pockets. So it's more important that the pocket sits flat than the drill hole is in the perfect position, because knit fabric has a tendency to move as you cut it, but we just need to make sure that those drill holes are covered. And the other thing we're looking for is to make sure that this is nice and straight to the neckline, because you don't want your pockets sitting off at an angle either way. So make sure that's nice and flat, and when you're happy we're going to start sewing it. Now I'm going to start sewing it from this edge here. I'm going to do a small back tack, come down here, stop and pivot. So I stop with my needle down in the corner. I'm going to lift my presser foot, turn and pivot, back around to the beginning, to the other side of the beginning here of the pocket, and I'm going to back tack here as well. So this is where our hand's going to go in up here like this. So take your time. You might need a silicone foot or a roller foot. See how you go. And where I'm going to stitch is on the edge, or just in from the edge. So it's 1/8 of an inch in, which is around about 2 or 3 millimeters. I'm just going to use the guide on my foot as just a reference point for that. Right, so now go back to your iron and give that a press, because that'll just give your final garment a really nice look, and the iron also helps to embed the polyester thread into the fabric. So the first thing we're going to sew is the centre back pleat. So here is our centre back fabric, and at the centre you will have a notch, and then you'll have a notch on either side. Now part way down from the notch you'll have a drill hole, and we'll deal with that in just a moment. So take the centre back neck area of the back piece, we're going to fold this right sides together until these two notches are on top of each other like so. And what I'm going to do is just pin that in place. Now to get a nice perfect pleat, what we're going to do, making sure that those notches are on top of each other and that the centre back notch is on the fold here, is we're going to stitch from the notch there down. Now the two drill holes need to be on top of each other, so the drill holes were here. So what we're going to do is stitch parallel, we want to be parallel to this folded edge here, towards the drill hole, and then we want to stitch past the drill hole by 1 centimetre, which is 3/8 of an inch. So when we go past this drill hole, we want to just make sure we're on this side of it so that if it creates any physical holes in our fabric, they're hidden. So what we want to do is, just turn our machine on, just make sure you do a couple of back tacks to begin and back tack when you finish. So here's my drill hole here. I'm just going to scoop past it just very slightly, and then I'm going to stitch past it 1 centimetre, which is 3/8 of an inch, and I'm going to back tack and snap off. So that's what we're looking for, like that. Right, so the next step is to open this up so we have right side out, and then we're going to place that line we've just stitched, or those two notches, on the centre back notch like this. You see that there? And I'll just pop a pin to hold that in place. And now just to make sure that that's in the right place and it stays that way when we sew the neckband on, I'm going to run a row of tacking stitches within the seam allowance here. Now the seam allowance is 6mm, which is 1/4 of an inch. So basically that means I'm just going to stitch very close to the edge, 3mm, 1/8 of an inch, like so. So we're just holding that pleat in place. So this is a box pleat on this side, which is an inverted pleat on the other, like that. So there is our lovely pleat. So you might want to go and give that a press and make sure it's sitting nice and firmly flat. So what I'm going to do now is sew the shoulders. So making sure your back is right side up, place your front right side down. And we're going to sew the shoulder seam here. Now you might find this challenging, as I said, sewing the knit to a woven, but just give it a go and see how you go with it. There's a slight angle here, but just work your way through it. Now the other thing is, depending on the lightness of your fabric, you might find things stretch as well. That's the fun of using chiffons. They can be a little bit challenging, so a lot of these sheer fabrics are challenging to sew. So when you're ready, match the raw edges of the shoulder, and there's a notch here which shows us the hem allowance for the sleeve, and that's the hem allowance for the short sleeve. And we're going to sew this seam at 3/8 of an inch, which is 1 centimetre. So remember to back tack. And we're going to sew all our seams at once, and then we're going to overlock all of our seams at the same time. So just take your time and sew this together. It can be a little challenging. And that was surprisingly easier to sew than I had anticipated it was going to be. I think that's possibly because the chiffon is so light and sheer and has a bit of movement in it. Alright, so when you've finished one shoulder, you can do the other shoulder. So let's go to the overlocker now and edge tidy those seams. Now I've used a 4-threader on my overlock to tidy those seams. It's really only necessary to have a 3-thread. I'm doing that just because I like the look of it, and it gives me more security. The other thing I am doing is overlocking that with the woven fabric on top. It just helps control the fact that I can see where the knit edge is. So now it's time to complete the hems on both the front and the back separately. So the front, because it's a knit fabric, has a hem allowance of 1.5 centimeters, which is 9/16 of an inch, and the back, because it's a woven, has got a hem allowance of 1 centimeter, which is 3/8 of an inch. So what does that mean? Well, everything's notched in the correct place, so the very first thing you need to do is, if you have a cover stitcher, cover stitch the front at 1.5 centimeters. If you don't, you can do what I'm going to do, which is overlock the raw edge, turn it up, and then stitch it with 2 lines of plain stitching, or you could use a twin needle on a domestic sewing machine. So it's a good idea to press these into place before you decide to stitch them. So for the knit hem, there's a notch to show you where to turn this up. I'm going to sew 1 row of stitching right in that overlocking line, and then I'm going to sew a 2nd row of stitching parallel to it. And with the back, I'm just going to sew 1 row of stitching on the woven fabric. So give those hems another really good press. That will just help embed the stitches in, and also if you have any wobbles. Now if you have any majors with the the woven fabric, it's probably because you haven't cut that curve properly with the woven. Sometimes if you're using a fabric like chiffon, it might move too much, so just make sure the curve is smooth and you won't have a problem with sewing that hem. You could also reduce the hem allowance to 5mm, which is just under 1/4 of an inch if you had a major problem with it, and it wouldn't affect the pattern at all. Okay, so we're going to sew the side seam now. So this is the hemline here. Now at the hemline, we want our stitch lines to match. Now we're going to sew a 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance here. You'll probably find it easier if you have the knit fabric on top and the woven underneath. And as well as that, we sort of need to make them sit over like this because we want the seam at 1 centimetre to be right on the edge. So we don't match this raw edge here, we want to match where it's going to stitch. So guesstimate 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch, and cross those over. And what we want to do is just to make absolutely certain that is our start point with our stitching. So there. That's a little bit too far, I'll just rearrange that. So back tack there. Right, so now sew up the side seam in a 1 centimetre, which is a 3/8 of an inch allowance. Now if you have any majors with easing this in, all you need to do is every now and then lift up your presser foot and release the tensions, and that will just help make sure everything ends up in the right place. Now if you're sewing the long sleeve view, it's really easy now, you just keep stitching right to the edge and back tack. If you're sewing the short sleeve view, there's just a small angle we have to stitch. So stitch up to, you're directly opposite that notch position, and then just lift up and keep that 1 centimetre allowance. It sort of angles off from there to there, and back tack. Now we're going to go to our overlocker and overlock tidy that edge and do the same for the other side. So for the long sleeve version, what we do is before you sew the side seams, we put the sleeve into the armhole area, making sure the underarm matches, and then what we're going to do next is sew the side seam. So I've sewn the side seam of the garment from the front hem, I've come up through the side seam, and I'm continuing through to the wrist. So all that remains now is to do the sleeve hem. If you have a cover stitch it at the notch position, which is 1.5 centimetres or 9/16 of an inch. What I'm going to do is overlock and flat stitch. So to complete the hem, turn at the notches to the wrong side. So the notches are at 1.5 centimetres or 9/16 of an inch. And then twin needle or plain stitch this into position. And because I've done it with my other knit pieces, I'm just going to sew a second row of stitching parallel to the first. Now when you've done both hem allowances, this is how the hem should look, a nice smooth curved transition. Take this length of overlocking thread and just trim it back to 2.5 centimeters, which is 1 inch, and we need to tidy this up. So what we're going to do is tuck that overlocking thread up within the hem allowance, bring the back over the front, and then we're just going to stitch directly on top of that hem allowance on that stitch line on the woven. It's only 2 or 3 stitches, and back tack to secure it. Now that does a couple of things. That will help make sure that our seam allowance faces towards the back, and also it will tidy up that messy edge of the overlocking and secure it without unravelling. Of course you might have another method you use for that, but that is often the most secure and easiest way to get rid of that. And then we need to give our garment a press, and we want to press it so that that hem, that seam, is facing towards the back like so. So now we're going to prepare the neckband. So take your piece and place it right sides together, and we're going to overlock this short edge. If you're going to use your overlocker for this, make sure you have 4 threads of colour, because we need the 1 to secure, the 1 to stitch and the 3 to secure. Okay. Now this step isn't essential, I'm just going to do it because we're working with a light floaty sheer fabric. Trying to control that and trying to control the neckband can be quite difficult, especially if your knit fabric is a little bit difficult and curly. So what I'm going to do is fold this wrong sides together, and I'm going to tack stitch those raw edges together within the seam allowance. So the seam allowance for this is going to be 6mm, which is 1/4 inch. So when we stretch this on, this is going to snap, but the tacking stitch will be within the seam allowance and you won't see it, especially if you use a colour that matches your fabric. And this will also just ensure that the width of our neckband stays consistent. So just, it's about it's about 1/8 of an inch, so just 2mm, 3mm in from the edge. And as you go around, make sure those raw edges are together. Just make sure the notches aren't too deep. But match the notches as you go. Please forgive me today, I have a cold and I know I'm sounding very nasally. And because it's a tack stitch, there's no real need to back tack at the beginning and end. So let's just have a look at this neckband. This seam here is going to go to our centre back, and then directly opposite it we have a notch up here which is going to sew to our centre front, and then we have 2 notches here. Now they're going to sew to the notch on the neckband. I'm not going to call it a shoulder, generally it's a shoulder, but it's just the notch on the neckband at this stage. So you'll need some pins or other ways of securing this. before we go too much further. And because we're working with a sheer fabric, we're also going to tack stitch this neckband into place before we overlock it. Right, so place your garment wrong side out and take your neckband. We're going to place it inside. This is just because it's a lot easier to stitch with the neckband on top. So place the seam of the neckband onto the centre back seam where we made that pleat and secure that in place. Right, so when you have that pin in place, come around to where the knit meets the woven and you'll find a notch to match there. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that seam faces down towards the knit, and then put that notch on the intersect point there. And as we come around to the centre front, there'll be a notch, and that will match. And then come round to the next position where the knit meets the woven. Now if you're like me here and there's a little bit of a discrepancy, put the notch on the shortest part, and when we're overlocking it we'll just smooth out the difference like that. But we'll do that when we tack stitch it, so we'll just make sure that there's no wobbles or anything like that. So the main thing we need to do now is make sure that those positions are in the correct place, and again make sure that that seam allowance is faced down. So what we're going to do is tack stitch this into place. I'm going to start from one side of the centre back, and just like I did with that collar, that neckband, I'm just going to tack stitch that within the seam allowance. Now this is going to be a little bit more challenging because it's a light flowy fabric. It can shred. We just want to make sure that we hold the fabric in place. The overlocking will sort it out later. So just start with a couple of stitches. Make sure they're only 3mm, so 1/8 of an inch from the edge. And now with sheer fabrics, so the first thing we have to do is make sure that that pleat is going to be nice up here. So just double check you've got everything and stitch to the edge of it like that, just to make sure it's going to look good when it's being worn. Right, so hold on to the next notch position and just straighten out that chiffon at the back. Sometimes you might find it easier to just go a little bit further over with the chiffon than you won't normally need to. Now I'm saying chiffon, but I mean woven, whatever woven you've chosen. So the other thing is that not all chiffons are created equal. Some are really easy to sew, excuse me, and some are really horrific. Generally you get what you pay for. So in New Zealand there's one called ponytail chiffon, which is amazing to sew. Excuse me, and some of the others are just terrible. If you go for an expensive one, you'll be fine. Should be fine, from a reputable company. So here is where I sort of staggered that sewing, so I sewed it badly, and as you can tell all I'm going to do is just smooth the transition out. So I'll take that away, and we just want to make sure that it's nice and easy on the eye. Now all of this fraying can be dealt with later. Hopefully the overlocker blade will take off a lot of that. Okay, so we're coming back onto the centre back area. but just make sure that that centre back pleat is sitting perpendicular, which means at right angles to the neckband when we come to here, and then just stitch back up to around about the starting position. So now we've got that secured in place, it's going to make it an awful lot easier to overlock it. So here is our neckband tack stitched into place. It's a good idea to not start the overlocking from the centre back because it's going to be too obvious when it's being worn. I'm going to start about midway over here, and I'm going to make sure that the neckband's on top when I stitch. So to get a nice even neckband, just keep an eye on the distance between the edge of the foot and the fold here, but the fact that we've tack stitched this all into place will make it an awful lot easier when you sew it. Now when you do stitch this in, this needs to have 4 threads in your machine. When you come up on this pleat, just make sure that it's all sitting nice and flat as you sew past. Okay, so we're going to sew the hem of the short sleeve version. So this is the front of the garment here. So when we sew this hem, we need to overlock the raw edge here. When you overlock that raw edge, you want to make sure this knit hem here is facing onto the knit, and then when you come down to where it joins the back here, you want to make sure that's facing the woven. So basically you want both seams to face that way when you overlock, seal the edge. Now take this to your iron and press a 1.5 centimetre, which is 9/16 of an inch hem allowance in.
So when you start to sew this hem allowance in on the short sleeve version, I suggest you start from this point here. So this is almost the underarm point, that's where the front joins the back, I suppose it's the side seam. That's because if there's any adjustments you need to make with the curve of the woven fabric, you can sort of manipulate it into the stretchy part, so sew that part last. So start stitching your seam allowance at that position there at 1.5 centimetres. Now, if you're using a footproof sheer fabric like iron, it can be a bit challenging, so just take your time and make sure you have it nice and straight.
And to tidy up the edge of that overlocking, I'm just going to tuck it into the hem allowance there. And if you'd like to, go ahead and sew a second row of stitching parallel to the first. And I'm clearly having a bad day because normally I would have sewn that with the garment inside out just to make that seam easier to sew, especially because I'm sewing it from the right side. Of course you could sew it from the wrong side if you prefer. So that's it, our garment is finished. Hey, thanks for joining me with the sew along. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and if you want, join my Facebook pattern discussion group and you'll get notification of new releases and sales. See you again soon.